Power can twist the human soul in ways the mind can barely imagine. And in the marble halls of ancient Rome, cruelty wasn't just hidden, it was performed. Among Rome's elite, one man's name became a symbol of luxury, madness, and unrestrained evil: Publius Vettius Pelio. He wasn't an emperor, but his influence and brutality made him act like one. And in his private villa, guests whispered about a sight too disturbing to forget: a pool where people were fed to his pet lampreys. Pollio lived during the reign of Emperor Augustus, the man who brought peace to Rome after years of bloody civil wars. But peace in the empire didn't mean peace in every heart. Pollio's estate at Posillipo near Naples was a paradise of marble courtyards, scented gardens, and shimmering pools. Yet beneath that beauty lay something far darker: a fish pond where hundreds of lampreys, long, eel-like predators with rows of teeth, swam in hungry silence. These creatures weren't there for show, they were punishment. The story that survived through centuries began at one of Pollio's extravagant banquets. The guests reclined on silk couches, surrounded by dancers and servants carrying trays of figs, oysters, and golden wine. Every plate sparkled. Every crystal cup caught the glow of candlelight. But one trembling servant made a mistake. He dropped one of those prized crystal cups. It shattered against the marble floor. The sound froze the room. Pollio's eyes turned cold. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. Instead, he gave a quiet order that sent chills through the room. "Throw him to the eels." The servant screamed, begging for mercy. Everyone watched, helpless, as guards dragged him toward the pond outside, a pond where Pollio's lampreys waited. But that night, fate placed another man at the table: Augustus himself, Rome's emperor, the most powerful man on earth. As the slave was dragged away, Augustus raised his hand. "Stop," he said. The room went silent. He called the terrified servant forward, then turned to Pollio with calm disgust. "You would kill a man for breaking glass?" he asked. Then, without waiting for an answer, Augustus ordered all of Pollio's crystal cups shattered, and his lamprey ponds filled in with stones. The banquet ended not in blood, but in humiliation. For Pollio, the man who thought himself untouchable. But Rome's cruelty didn't end with him. The man without a crown could feed humans to beasts. What happened when the actual emperors took the throne? After the death of Augustus, Rome began to change. The empire grew richer, stronger, but behind the marble statues and public speeches, the poison of power spread deeper. The story of Vettius Pollio had shocked Rome, but it didn't stop others from following his path. In fact, one emperor would turn Pollio's cruelty into entertainment, a public show of terror for the crowds. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history remembers him by one word: Caligula. Caligula didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to rule fear itself. At first, people loved him, a young, charming leader, promising to restore the glory of his family, the line of Caesar. But absolute power began to consume him. Within months, stories spread across the empire, whispers of madness, megalomania, and unspeakable punishments. And soon, the emperor, who had once fed on the cheers of his people, began feeding his beasts with human flesh. Ancient historian Suetonius wrote that during his grand games and spectacles, Caligula often grew impatient with delays. When the arena ran short of animals, he gave a simple order: feed them prisoners. The audience thought it was a joke. It wasn't. Men and women accused of petty crimes were thrown before hungry lions, leopards, and bears. The crowd watched as blood soaked the sand, unsure whether to cheer or look away. In Caligula's mind, the difference between man and beast no longer mattered. Everything human or animal existed for his amusement. But Caligula's cruelty didn't stop at the arena. He began keeping exotic animals in his palace: tigers, leopards, even snakes as symbols of divine power. Some accounts say he would walk among them at night, whispering as if they were his equals. He believed himself to be a living god, and the beasts were his sacred companions. To disobey him was not a crime against Rome, it was a crime against divinity. When food ran low, he mocked his people by ordering his guards to seize bystanders and feed them to the beasts. According to some records, he once told his guards, "They say the lions are hungry, then give them Romans." For Caligula, fear was control. Pain was proof of power. He inherited the cruelty of Palio, but magnified it into a public theater, a spectacle where humanity was stripped away for applause.
Oh.
The emperor didn't just feed people to his pets. He fed his empire to madness, but Caligula's end would be as shocking as his rule. Because when the beasts of power are unleashed, even emperors can be eaten by their own creation. By the time Caligula's reign reached its breaking point, fear had replaced loyalty in every Roman heart. Senators bowed not out of respect, but to survive another day. Soldiers stood guard in silence, eyes empty, trained not to think, only to obey. Even inside the imperial palace, whispers echoed through the marble halls. Who will be next? Because under Caligula, no one was safe. Not nobles, not generals, not even family. His madness deepened with every passing year. He spoke to the moon, claimed he could command the sea, and built golden stables for his horse Insiditus, whom he planned to make a consul. But behind the absurdity, there was real blood. Prisoners disappeared in the night. Bodies fed as animals. And Caligula's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a god who demanded constant sacrifice. One story tells of how he invited noble guests to dinner, smiling warmly as he poured their wine. Then, with a laugh, he whispered that he could order them all killed and fed to his lions, and no one would question it. The guests froze, unsure whether it was a joke. It wasn't. In Caligula's Rome, fear itself had become the emperor's favorite pet. But the empire was rotting from within. The very guards who once carried out his cruel orders began to loathe him. They had seen too much innocent citizens fed to beasts, senators publicly humiliated, even his own sisters used as pawns in his twisted games. The Praetorian Guard, once his shield, began to sharpen their swords for someone else. In January of 41 AD, the inevitable happened. As Caligula walked through an underground corridor beneath the palace after attending a festival, a small group of guards surrounded him. For once, he had no audience. No lions, no laughter, just the quiet sound of steel. The emperor, who fed people to his pets, now faced the beasts he had created, men stripped of mercy. The blade struck quickly, ending his reign in a blur of rage and silence. When the news spread, Rome didn't mourn. Some even celebrated. But deep inside the empire's heart, something darker remained. Because cruelty like Caligula's doesn't die with one man, it leaves a scar. And soon, other rulers would rise, each learning from the terror before them, each more dangerous than the last. For Rome, this was not the end of madness. It was only the beginning. Caligula's death should have ended the nightmare, but Rome had already tasted blood. What began as the madness of one man soon became a system, a culture of entertainment built on human suffering. The amphitheaters, once symbols of civic pride, turned into laboratories of cruelty. And the emperors who followed learned a grim lesson. To keep control of the masses, you must feed their hunger for death. When Emperor Nero took the throne years later, he inherited not just Rome's power, but its obsession with spectacle. His rule was a theater of extremes, music, art, and fire. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered it. To silence the whispers, he turned the blame toward a small, growing group, the Christians. Then came one of history's most horrifying acts. Nero ordered hundreds of them to be fed alive to wild beasts in the arena. The crowds cheered as lions and leopards tore through the helpless victims. Some were wrapped in animal skins so the beasts would attack faster. Others were burned alive to light Nero's garden parties. According to Tacitus, Rome's own historian, the suffering was so great that even the crowd, hardened by years of blood, began to pity them. But Nero didn't stop. He saw pity as weakness. For him, the screams were music. Under Domitian, cruelty became spectacle refined. He organized elaborate beast hunts, not only for criminals, but also for slaves, soldiers, and anyone who displeased him. Exotic animals were shipped from across the empire, elephants, tigers, bears, all trained to kill on command. The line between punishment and performance vanished completely. Rome's elite dressed in jewels while watching men and animals destroy each other. The sand of the Colosseum soaked up more blood than any battlefield, and in the emperor's private chambers, stories whispered that certain rulers kept pet beasts, lions, panthers, or bears, fed not with raw meat, but with living prisoners. The empire had become addicted to death. The people who once cheered for victory in war now cheered for executions. The emperors called it justice. The poets called it spectacle. But history remembers it for what it was, a civilization that began feeding itself to its own darkness. Rome's power had reached its peak, yet its soul had rotted. And in the centuries that followed, that same idea, using animals, pain, and terror as symbols of dominance, would travel beyond Rome's borders, shaping cruel kings and despots across the ancient world. Rome's fall didn't end humanity's hunger for power. It only spread it. Across distant lands and centuries, rulers who had never seen the Colosseum still learned its language, the power to terrify through spectacle. From Asia to the Middle East, monarchs discovered their own ways to make death a performance in animals. Once sacred symbols became weapons of punishment. In the East, ancient records tell of emperors who turned royal menageries into torture grounds. In the Chinese Han Dynasty, a ruler known for his paranoia and rage, Emperor Wu of Han, was said to have kept wild beasts not just for display, but for executions. His palace menagerie contained tigers, leopards, and bears. When courtiers betrayed his trust or servants disobeyed, some were thrown to the beasts. Officially, it was called punishment by nature. In truth, it was a warning written in screams. Further west, in the mighty Persian Empire, kings like Artaxerxes and Shapur created terrifying punishments that mirrored Rome's cruelty. Persian chronicles mention a practice called the Pit of Beasts, where prisoners of war or traitors were thrown into enclosed spaces with lions or leopards, forced to fight for their lives. The victims rarely lasted long. For the kings, it wasn't about justice, it was about fear. The throne survives longer when people are too terrified to look at it. Even in India, some rulers embraced the same dark tradition. During the Mauryan era, wild elephants were sometimes used for public executions. Their massive feet could crush bones with a single step, and their handlers trained them to prolong the agony, to break, not kill, until the ruler gave the signal. The sight of it was enough to keep crowds loyal. What united these kingdoms was not their language or their gods, but their belief that cruelty equals control. To them, a ruler's mercy was weakness, his wrath divine. The beasts became mirrors of their masters, wild, bloodthirsty, untamed. And yet, in every empire, there were whispers, servants who pitied the condemned, scribes who recorded the truth, and travelers who told the tales in secret, because deep down humanity recognized the horror. The emperors thought they ruled the beasts, but in the end it was the beasts that ruled them. As centuries passed, the practice evolved. The arenas vanished. But the idea that power must be seen, that fear must be shown, survived in darker corners of history. And soon, a new empire would rise that turned this cruelty into its greatest form of entertainment. One made of stone, sand, and screams, the Roman Colosseum itself. It stood like a crown on Rome's head, massive, perfect, and hollow. The Colosseum, completed under Emperor Titus around 80 AD, was more than an arena. It was the empire's mirror, beautiful from afar, but filled with the cries of the damned. What had once been the private cruelty of men like Pollio and Caligula was now reborn as public entertainment. And the citizens of Rome, who once trembled before their rulers, now cheered for blood themselves. The opening games lasted 100 days. Over 9,000 wild animals were killed, lions, bears, tigers, elephants, and thousands of humans too. The emperor called it a gift to the people, a celebration of Rome's glory. But every roar, every scream, every drop of blood in the sand whispered something else. This was control, disguised as entertainment. Emperors like Titus and later Trajan used these spectacles to remind the masses of their power. Criminals, prisoners of war, and anyone deemed unworthy were thrown to beasts for sport. Sometimes they were forced to fight back with wooden swords, mocked by the crowd as they begged for mercy. The animals, starved for days, tore them apart in front of thousands. Historians called these games Venetians' beast hunts, but for the victims, it was execution by spectacle. In one account, Emperor Commodus, the same ruler later dramatized in Gladiator, fought in the arena himself. He dressed as Hercules, striking down helpless men and animals to prove his divinity. When the crowd hesitated to cheer, he threatened to feed them to the beasts. The emperor who should have been worshipped became addicted to applause soaked in blood. And yet, not all Romans were blind. Seneca, the philosopher, wrote of watching the games in disgust. He said the spectators were learning cruelty by habit. He was right. The Colosseum wasn't just killing people. It was killing compassion. The citizens who once pitied the condemned now demanded more blood to feel alive. Over time, the Colosseum devoured more lives than any war of its age. It became the heart of Rome's identity, a symbol of entertainment, dominance, and death. But as centuries passed, its stones began to crumble, and the echo of screams faded into silence. Still, the lesson it left behind remained. Once cruelty becomes culture, no empire, no matter how powerful, can escape its own darkness. Because in Rome's heart, the beasts were never truly in cages. They were in the emperor, and in the crowd that cheered him on. History often remembers the emperors, their names carved in marble, their cruelty told in stories. But the people who suffered under them, the thousands thrown to animals, burned alive, or torn apart for the crowd's amusement, are lost in the dust. Yet without them, Rome's cruelty cannot be understood. They were the true faces of the empire's power and its madness. Many of the victims were slaves, taken from conquered lands. They had no names, no graves, and no rights. Some were captured soldiers, dragged from distant provinces like Gaul, Egypt, or Judea, men who had once fought for their freedom, now reduced to prey. Others were criminals, or simply accused of crimes without proof. Rome's justice didn't need truth. It needed examples. The emperor would announce a spectacle. The prisons would empty their bodies, feeding both beasts and the people as thirst for violence. In the Colosseum's underground tunnels, known as the Hypogeum, hundreds of men and women waited in darkness. They could hear the roaring above, lions pacing in cages, crowds shouting, drums beating. When the gates opened, the sunlight blinded them. Then came the growls. The animals, starved for days, were released through hidden elevators, the air filled with screams that the Romans called music of the games. Among them were also the early Christians, blamed by Emperor Nero for the Great Fire of Rome. Tacitus wrote that they were wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or coated in pitch and burned alive to light Nero's gardens. For the crowd, it was spectacle. For the victims, it was the end of faith and flesh in the same moment. The emperor watched from his throne, calling it justice in the name of Rome. There were women, too, some accused of witchcraft, others enslaved from conquered kingdoms. They were thrown to beasts in staged myths, forced to act as figures from Roman legend before being killed. To the spectators, it was theater. To the condemned, it was horror disguised as art. Few records name them. Most were erased completely, their bones buried beneath the Colosseum's sand. But their silence speaks louder than the emperor's decrees. They remind us that history's glory was built on human screams, and that every empire hides its victims somewhere, behind walls, behind pride, or behind applause. Their stories were never carved in stone. But the blood that soaked the Colosseum did not disappear. It became part of Rome itself, a ghost in the marble, whispering a warning to every ruler who believes power makes them a god. As the empire trembled under the weight of fear, even Caligula's closest allies began to whisper in the shadows. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal to his throne, now watched their emperor feed senators to his lions, while he laughed as if it were a festival. His cruelty had gone beyond politics. It had become madness on full display. He claimed divine rights, demanded worship, and called himself a living god. Yet behind those marble halls, even the guards began to realize a god who devoured his own people was not immortal. He was doomed. By the year 41 AD, conspiracies had woven through the palace walls. Senators, officers, and servants, all terrified, yet united by a single thought: the monster must fall. They had seen too much: the screams in the courtyard, the piles of bones near the menagerie, and the emperor's unholy joy in watching it all. Caligula had not only executed nobles and generals, but also humiliated them before feeding their families to his wild pets. Rome itself was bleeding, and its savior would not come from the heavens, but from within the palace itself. On a cold January morning, Caligula entered the theater of the Palatine Hill, expecting applause. Instead, shadows closed in. His own Praetorian guards turned against him. Cassius Chaerea, one of his officers, struck the first blow. The emperor, who had fed men to beasts, now faced the same terror he had once enjoyed watching. Reports say he screamed, not for mercy, but in disbelief, as if gods could not die. And in that blood-soaked moment, the laughter that once echoed through Rome fell silent. When his body was dragged away, the city did not mourn. But the aftermath was strange. The empire, shaken by years of horror, felt both relief and emptiness. The animals he'd once cherished were slaughtered, and his gardens of death were burned. The Senate tried to erase his name from every monument, chiseling away his memory from stone. But history, unlike marble, never forgets. For centuries, the story of Caligula, the emperor who fed people to his pets, became a symbol of absolute corruption. Some Roman historians claim the tales were exaggerated, that perhaps wild gossip mixed with truth. Yet the bones discovered near his private arena tell another story, one written not in ink, but in remains. The man who called himself divine was devoured not by lions, but by his own sins. Still across time, his name lingers, not as a god, not as a ruler, but as a warning. Long after Caligula's death, Rome tried to cleanse itself of his madness. Statues of the emperor were smashed, his face scratched off coins, and his name forbidden to speak aloud. Yet his ghost lingered, not in the form of spirit or superstition, but in the memory of what absolute power can do to the human mind. Caligula's reign had proven that when a man begins to see himself as a god, he stops seeing others as human. Historians centuries later still argue about the truth behind the stories. Did he really feed people to lions and panthers for his amusement? Or were the tales a political weapon, exaggerated by those who wanted to destroy his legacy? Roman chroniclers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe scenes so horrific they read like nightmares. Prisoners torn apart by beasts, nobles hunted in gardens, and the emperor watching, smiling, sipping wine as screams filled the air. Even if half of it was true, it painted a chilling picture of what Rome had allowed to exist inside its marble heart. But there was another layer to the horror, the pleasure he took in it. Caligula's feasts were not only of food and wine, but of fear itself. He found joy in domination and proving that no one could defy him, not even nature. He ordered wild animals to be brought from Africa at enormous cost, not for display, but for slaughter, both of man and beast. Those who refused to worship him were made to join his pets in their cages. Some accounts say he whispered to them before releasing the lions, promising that they would serve Rome one last time. After his death, Rome tried to forget. But emperors who followed Nero, Commodus, Domitian would all echo his madness in different ways. It was as if Caligula's cruelty had planted a seed in the empire itself, one that grew again and again in different forms. The Colosseum, built decades later, became a symbol of this, a place where the suffering of others became entertainment, where human life was turned into spectacle. And so, the legacy of Caligula lived on, not as a man, but as a warning carved into history's bones. His story reminds us how thin the line is between civilization and chaos, between ruler and beast. When power loses mercy, when pleasure feeds on pain, humanity itself becomes the prey. Caligula believed he ruled as a god, but in truth, he was the darkest reflection of man, proof that even the greatest empire could be devoured from within.